Information overload is one of the most important yet least discussed issues of our time. The internet, ladies and gentlemen, is just like the Gutenberg printing press. When the Gutenberg printing press came to Europe, it revolutionized the continent and eventually the entire world. Now, how did it revolutionize the continent and the entire world? Well, before the Gutenberg printing press, which allowed books to be mass produced, came around, you see, education was restricted to a very small fraction of the population, right? You had maybe anywhere from, depending on the country, the county, the township that you lived in, you had anywhere from 5 to 20% of the population that was educated, that could read and write. And if they were reading and writing, a lot of the books were in Latin, so they had to usually go away from their townships to a bigger city where they could learn Latin and they could decipher the Bible and other historical texts via Latin, not in English, French, German, or whatever respective language that they were speaking. Eventually, the Gutenberg printing press came around, and two things happened. Firstly, books were now able to be mass produced, right? You didn't just have a big library in a city where all the nobility and the educated people from a local township would go to access historical records. Now you can mass produce those historical records. You could keep them in every single village. You could even keep them in your house. Secondly, a lot of the languages started printing books in their proprietary languages. If you're in England, they started printing books in English. If you're in France, they started printing books in French. And this whole Latin culture, while it stuck around in the church, it sort of died down. Now this revolutionized the continent. For the first time, the average person, right, in a few generations, the average person went from relying on priests, relying on their lord, relying on some sort of external figure to tell them what is truth, what is not truth, to tell them what accurate history is and what inaccurate history is, to being able to read for themselves and formulate their own opinions. The internet is the exact same thing, right? The internet is the new Gutenberg printing press. For the first time in human history, the masses now have an audience. Just 40 years ago, if you wanted to have an audience, there were so many gatekeepers along the way. You had to go to a news channel. They had to verify who you are, your character. They had to see what you were going to talk about. If you're on a right-wing news channel and you have a lot of left-wing talking points, I don't know if they'd let you talk. If you're in a particular country and you want to criticize that country, I doubt they'd let you talk. So the internet is one of the most, if not the most, revolutionary advent when it comes to the communication of information, especially the mass communication and the mass distribution of information. And secondly, the internet allows for media. People can speak to each other, and because people can speak to each other, it introduces a whole new level of ease. You don't need to read through literature or read through books that might contain sophisticated grammar. You can speak to people at like a 5th or 6th grade speaking level and they'll understand you, right? So, information overload. I believe that back in the old day, when someone would speak out and have an opinion that was out of line, they would get deplatformed, meaning they would no longer have access to their platform. We saw this, with Twitter back in the day. A lot of people would get deplatformed and taken off the platform altogether. We saw this with multiple news agencies. If someone had an opinion that was slightly too right-wing, or maybe they were too left-wing, but they had some opinions that were criticizing perhaps the military-industrial complex or things of this nature, they'd get deplatformed. But eventually deplatforming, especially with the advent of the internet and the relaxation of censorship on certain social media platforms, became unfeasible. You can't deplatform anybody. And if you do deplatform them, they can just go somewhere else and seek refuge. So what do? Then came character assassinations. If you accuse someone of a crime, even if they end up being acquitted, later on, you have effectively destroyed their career. If you have a famous news anchor and the news anchor starts talking about things that you don't like, character assassinate him. Have some, criminal case from 20 years in the past, like what happened with Diddy, what happened with Epstein. Epstein was originally arrested in 2006. Funny how he didn't get charged. The Diddy files have been around for decades. There are multiple other people that I could name, but some of them still have legal investigations going on, so we'll have to see how that pans out. Now, you just character assassinate them. You accuse them of a heinous crime. Sometimes they did it, sometimes they didn't do it, of what happened, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, and even if they didn't do it, right? Okay, number one is they did it. And if they did do it, why didn't they just get prosecuted at the time? Why have the files been laying around for decades? And the reason they've been laying around is blackmail. But secondly, let's say they didn't do it, right? In our hypothetical situation, you have a news anchor who's speaking out of line, or you have a online media personality that's speaking out of line, and they didn't do whatever it is that they're accused of. Well, if you accuse them, you make them go to trial, you make them spend millions on legal fees, you defame them across all mainstream media platforms, and 2, 3, 4 years later, they end up getting acquitted. Do you really think that matters? Do you really think that matters? Their name has already been dragged through the mud. Lawfare has already robbed them of millions of dollars. No one wanted to associate with them for 2 to 4 years. So whatever their income was, especially if their income was reliant on media, they no longer have access to, and you effectively ruin their life with a false allegation. The goal now is not to censor the truth, but to put so much information out there that, you know, a lot of people have difficulty telling what the truth actually is. The goal used to be to deplatform people if they spoke out of line. Now it's to character assassinate people. So why is this happening, right? Why is there so much information on the internet? And you honestly have an inability to tell what is the truth and what is not the truth. And I'll get to how to tell the truth apart in a moment here. The reason is very simple, ladies and gentlemen. The reason is influence. You see, wars are nothing more than a battle for influence. Think about every single war that happened. A war is simply a battle for influence. You want a particular country to have influence over a particular region. You want that particular region to speak the language of your country, to adopt the customs of your country, to maybe adopt the thinking of your country, to maybe you want to install a government there that is more friendly to your country. Wars are nothing more than, a battle for influence. It's a battle for how people think. You want to control how people think, how people feel, how the masses feel. And wars on the internet are very much the same thing. The reason there's so much information out there, and the reason all of it skews in a particular direction, is because you want to control what people think. So why do they want to control what people think? Because a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the mainstream consensus out there doesn't actually serve them. It doesn't actually bring about a good life for them. And if they woke up and they realized that, you could have potentially a lot of societal decay or societal discohesion at hand. A lot of the policies that particular governments may be enacting may be detrimental to their citizens. And if the citizens realize that they were detrimental, they could have a significant issue on their hands. So instead, they engage in culture wars, or they engage in putting so much information out there that you don't even know what to discuss. So what is truth? Truth is pro-human. Truth is pro-life. Truth is not something that is anti-life. Truth is not something that is anti-human. When you hear something that is fundamentally anti-human, the climate agenda, cough, cough, but when you hear something that is fundamentally anti-human, that wants you to alter the way that you live in a way that tells you to not have kids, which is like the primary reason we're here, to reproduce and to recreate, to tell you that, forces you to give up certain amenities in your life that has no actual bearing on, how the world would function at large, but you've somehow been manipulated or convinced that it would have a somewhat of a significant, difference. And truth is not always kind, but truth is aimed to shatter your illusions and provide you with an accurate mental model as to how the world actually works. There's a great quote by Dostoevsky, one of my favorite authors, who said, "It's better to know the truth and live in internal darkness than to be happy in a fool's paradise." I'm paraphrasing, but something along those lines. And that fundamentally is very true, right? His quote about truth, Dostoevsky's quote about truth, is true. It's better to know how systems work, how mechanisms work, how governments work, than it is to live in a fool's paradise. Now, all of this video sounds very conspiratorial. You have to read between the lines, and that is on purpose. You will have to read between the lines, and some of you might get lost and not know what I'm talking about. Whenever you come across a piece of information, ladies and gentlemen, ask yourself, why does this particular source want me to think this way? Are they trying to influence me? Are they trying to funnel me to a particular product? Are they owned by someone? Are they owned by a particular government? If they're owned by a particular government, and that government, especially like a lot of media companies, is not very popular with the people, is the government incentivized in telling the truth and providing an objective analysis as to what is happening? Or is the government incentivized to cast an illusion as to what is happening and not really get to the truth of the matter? These are questions that you need to ask yourself. And the more you exercise the muscle of critical thinking, the stronger the muscle becomes. And eventually you end up in this place where you begin to question everything, but through enough research, through enough due diligence, you are able to formulate your own opinions. And you very quickly realize that the world is not black and white. The world is actually very gray. When you see someone take a passionate, fierce stand on, issues that are very gray, you almost feel bad for them because you realize that they've been indoctrinated. The world is very gray. That is one of the main realizations that you have. But ladies and gentlemen, information overload, the wide prevalence of information, is a great issue of our time. Hopefully you out there are able to decipher truth from untruth, and you recognize that truth is fundamentally pro-human at its core. Truth should inspire you to live your life in a better mechanism, not because truth in a better way, not because truth is inherently kind. A lot of the times it isn't kind, but what it does do is it provides you with an accurate mental model as to how the world actually works, and you can go and take that accurate mental model and use it through your own effort, hard work, and determination to actualize a result that would actually be good for you. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, that is it.